lecture series. So I'm saying that again because the recording just started. And I'll be delivering the Science, Technology, and Health lecture, in particular with a focus on innovation and emerging technology. Just a caveat, I'm not really necessarily an expert in science. I'm not a scientist or a professional researcher. I did take up STEM courses in my undergraduate degree and such. But I'm just like any other debater with their own niches and their own personal interests. Like you may be interested in social movements, you may be interested in international relations. For me, what I am passionate about, despite not being a technical expert in, is science, technology, and health. So I want to start this lecture by diving right into the ethics. So essentially science, health, and the morals behind it. Before we delve into ethics, I want to talk about the dark history of scientific ethics, essentially the dark days of science. What were the kinds of experiments that are essentially allowed before, and how did they thrive? So if you guys haven't heard of some of these listed experiments that happened in the dark days of science, there's the Tuskegee syphilis study, which lasted from the 1930s to the 1970s, which examined the lives of untreated syphilis in African American men, uninformed about their disease status, so they didn't seek any treatment, and scientists would cease giving them treatment. Just to see how the disease would progress. There's also Dr. Krugman's hepatitis vaccination experiments, where mentally disabled children were purposely infected with the hepatitis virus. There's also Harlow's classic studies on the importance of maternal contact, which essentially involved the deprivation of infant monkeys of the touch of their mothers, and either isolating them in cages or giving them inanimate surrogate mothers made of terry cloth, or some of them just cold iron mothers, mother dolls, like monkey dolls. And so the experiment produced a lot of results about how it's important for these kinds of infants to receive maternal touch, how many of the infants preferred the terry cloth inanimate surrogates to the iron monkeys that were being provided and such. So countless other experiments that seemed cruel in nature with no apparent benefit were also conducted on animals, on humans alike. So when did we have a turnaround and started considering ethics as something important scientifically? Most people in the scientific community would say that World War II was an important landmark, as the world had to reckon with the scientific and medical experiments conducted within concentration camps. So you can do research on your own of the graphic extent of the atrocities within those concentration camps and the kinds of experiments that were extraordinarily unnecessary and cruel there. So only in the wake of the Nuremberg trials did global bodies start to put guidelines on biomedical research on humans. So is there a place for old unethical research in modern times? This is one of the debate topics that pop up every now and then. And of course, there are arguments for and against it. The general case for it is that knowledge is there and you might as well use it if it is unmistakably useful. That doesn't mean that you have to recreate these kinds of experiments. That doesn't mean that you have to legitimize the methodology, but once the knowledge is produced, it's already there and you might as well utilize it, or else the experiments were for nothing. And of course, if you go against the use of old unethical research, there's the principle about it being fundamentally abhorrent, and how in principle we shouldn't utilize it due to the atrocities that were deeply connected to it. And for the pragmatic, you could say that unethical experiments are fundamentally flawed in nature because most of the time they're just cruelty, they're just cruelty driven, curiosity driven, and have suboptimal results. So these are the general cases for or against old and ethical research and its place in modern times. But now we don't really see this as a major problem anymore because of the increasing regulatory bodies globally in science, and because of things like the precautionary principle in science. So the precautionary principle can be broken down into two different principles: strong precautionary principle and weak precautionary principle. So for the strong precautionary principle, the extent of the harm, how speculative the harm is, or how expensive regulations and safety policies are, they don't matter. We should always err on the side of caution. So examples of scientific endeavors that would fall under the strong precautionary principle are studies that would have eugenics-like implications. So if you're trying to do some correlational studies between race and intellect, or something that is extremely insensitive to the kinds of minorities that you want to research and experiment on and have dangerous implications that are similar to the implications of the Nazis and their own perspectives on the Aryan race and such, then there's the exercise of the strong precautionary principle there. However, that doesn't mean to say that the precautionary principle is considered perfect, especially the strong precautionary principle. So it provides a useful framework for managing risk in the face of scientific uncertainty, but it's actually widely derided as inflexible, unworkable, counterproductive, or anti-innovation. And the principle has been consistently attacked in academic literature on risk regulation, which is why, aside from the strong precautionary principle, we have the weak precautionary principle, which states that we have to evaluate the extent of risk and act on this basis. So it does not call for us to always err on the side of caution, because it says that if we can mitigate harms and if we have a certain level of understanding, we can allow for certain scientific action that may otherwise be considered as dubious. Where can we see this manifest in recent times? In recent times, there's a study where immunized people immunized for the COVID-19 strain were deliberately exposed to the virus. So they're volunteered to be deliberately infected, and this allowed us to produce results to see the effectivity of the different vaccines that we have and such. So it is a very important experiment, and in some ways it may be reminiscent of let's say the Tuskegee syphilis study or the hepatitis vaccination stories that I told you before, but the primary difference would be the consent of individuals and the amount of safeguards placed in ensuring that these individuals are not going to be highly at risk when they are purposefully infected with the COVID-19 disease. So that is an exercise of a weak precautionary principle, because we have the mitigation of harms, which was the fact that they're already immunized, and a level of understanding of how vaccines work. We allowed the action of actually infecting these people with the disease with their consent. And it allowed us to produce very fruitful results regarding our understanding of how effective our immunization against COVID-19 is. Now, I'm just going to brush through real quick the pillars of medical ethics, because I'm not a medical student. My background is in BS mathematics, and I have some MS mathematics units. So I just want to go through these 4 pillars and explain why they're important for debate. So first is autonomy. So autonomy is about honoring the patient's right to make their own decision and holding that decision above the decisions of their family, the decision of the doctors, the nurses in the situation, in the medical situation. The second pillar is beneficence, which is to help the patient advance his or her own good. So this is just to ensure that they're healing, just to ensure that they're recovering properly, and essentially doing all that you can to make sure that the ultimate prognosis is the best one. Non-maleficence is to do no harm. So we're not actively killing, torturing, suppressing the patient's ability to heal themselves, etc. And justice is about being fair and treating cases alike. So no preferential treatment for some specific patients over the others. Now in debates, the reason why it's always important to note pillars of ethics is because debates often call for the prioritization of certain pillars over the others. And sometimes, I think one of the most debatable ones would be justice. For example, in debates about the prioritization of the prioritization of where organ donation allocations ought to go. So that's an example of where do we treat cases fairly? Are we even allowed to prioritize on the basis of certain attributes, etc. In the same way that when we have social legal debates, we often have a push and pull between, let's say, retribution and rehabilitation. There can also be a push and pull between the different medical ethics, which is why it's important to familiarize yourself with all of them so that you can weigh in favor of some when the debate calls for it and defend which ones are more important according to whatever your case is. Thus ends the ethics portion of the talk, and I'm going to talk about now the research and the academe. So this is just about professional nerds, basically. So what is the role of the academe? So academic institutions such as universities, etc., have three main functions. Firstly is to transmit knowledge. The method of transmission of knowledge is often through teaching, formalized lectures, courses, etc. Secondly is the creation of knowledge, which happens through research, scientific discoveries of their faculty members and the scientists under those institutions. And third is act as a public knowledge resource, where they can disseminate information to the public through various databases, through journals, through their libraries, etc. Why do we do research in the first place? So I'd say we do research for four primary reasons. The first is to advance the state of scientific knowledge. The second is to contribute knowledge as public good. The third is to provide solutions to national, regional, or even global problems. And the fourth is to enrich the national talent pool with people who are able to compete in a knowledge-based global economy. Now, what are the types of research impacts there are? So I listed a bunch of research impacts, and I'm going to briefly talk about how do you assess the type of impact your research has. So scientific impact can usually be assessed by the production of new knowledge. So when you're able to produce new scientific articles, you are referring to an impact that is scientific in nature because it's about the addition of knowledge into this world, right? Second is technological impact. So this is through the creation of brand new technologies, and this often can manifest itself in patents, etc. Third is economic impact, which manifests itself in new wealth, such as startups, new jobs, and new types of livelihood. Policy impact means we have science-based policies, such as policies for solid waste management, policies for the lowering of greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Health impact, usually the indicators for this are improved quality of life, such as medical discoveries that improve things such as life expectancy, infant mortality rates, etc. Social impact, so this can be a variety of impacts on society wherein we avert death from natural disasters or something like that. And cultural impact, which can manifest or be indicated through the strengthening of identities, such as scientific discoveries for how we can preserve our heritage better, whether it be through our paintings, through our culture, through non-tangible aspects of our history, or through the actual preservation of artifacts. So these are the types of research impacts that exist, and you can utilize these kinds of impacts in research and debate when you want to show a variety of effects that scientific discoveries and research has on the world. Now, before we move on to further in this segment, we need to revisit the scientific process. So I'm sure that you guys are familiar with the scientific process in one way or another, but let's just go through it real quickly because it's the basis by which we acquire new knowledge, right? So the foundation of the scientific process is about asking a question, basically being curious. Next is to do your background research. So this is where you get your related literature when you're doing your research in school and whatnot. Third step is to construct a hypothesis, which is just a scientific guess for something, and to test that guess with an experiment. Now, if the procedure does not work, you have to test with another experiment up until it does work. If the experiment works, you analyze the data and draw conclusions. If it's aligned with the hypothesis, you can communicate these results. But if it's not aligned with the hypothesis, you can just create a new hypothesis and the procedure starts all over again. So this is the bread and butter of how we produce scientific discoveries. So this is the backbone of science, essentially. But what is the bread and butter of how we disseminate scientific information? We do this through scientific publications. So what is a scientific publication? A scientific publication is a research publication that is a standardized unit of peer-reviewed scientific knowledge that is committed to public record. So let's break down this sentence bit by bit so that we can fully understand. When we say standardized unit, it talks about the scope conforming to norms of the discipline. So whether that discipline be mathematics, whether it be engineering, etc. Peer-reviewed means that the content has undergone quality assurance. Scientific knowledge means that the subject matter is in the empirical domain of knowledge, etc. And committed to public record means that its content is publicly accessible and permanently traceable. So peer-reviewed journals. This is peer-reviewed journals are parts of scientific publication. And the way that they are peer-reviewed is essentially an editorial board would ask subject experts to review and evaluate submitted articles before accepting them for publication in a scholarly journal. Submissions are evaluated using criteria including the excellence, novelty, and significance of the research or ideas. So how do we measure scientific impact? A lot of the measuring of scientific impact or how important the research of an individual author or scientist is dependent on citation analysis. So it's oftentimes how often is your research and your journal article cited, the quality of those citations, what journals they come from. So I'm not as familiar with altmetrics and impact factor, but I understand that the H-index in particular is an author-level metric that evaluates the cumulative impact of an author's scholarly output and performance, it measures quantity and quality by comparing publications to citations. It also corrects for disproportionate weight of highly cited publications or the lower weight of publications that haven't been cited yet. So there are debates as to whether or not this is a good metric for, these metrics are good metrics for when something has a scientific impact. So the number of citations, essentially, I've encountered debates like that. So it's good to familiarize yourself with how these things are actually computed so that you know how fair they are, whether it can be skewed in favor of certain scientists disproportionately because of an oversighted article, etc., etc. Now, let's talk about some important research concepts and issues. And I want to talk about 4 in particular: on research universities, on inaccessibility, politics and skewed research, and blue skies research. So let's first delve into research universities. So the thing about research universities, or the possible controversies that lie in research universities, is whether or not it is burdensome for us to expect lecturers and professors to be both excellent researchers and excellent educators at the same time. We have to acknowledge that it's very much possible for you to be one thing and not necessarily the other thing. But oftentimes, research universities demand their staff to have consistent research output, and oftentimes their tenureship is dependent on those kinds of things. So does this push away or deter good educators, or does this undercredit and limit the opportunities of good educators who may not be producing as much research as certain peers that they have? On university rankings, so this usually happens with variables that include scientific impact, internationalization of the university, and multiple other variables. University rankings can be controversial because they allow for other universities that can provide quality education to be overshadowed by research universities that have a larger scope and a wider reach. However, just to counter that a little bit, university rankings also have their benefits in terms of recognition of universities in countries that aren't exactly known for their high scientific impact. For example, the Philippines, in the international sphere of education, we are slowly receiving recognition because of the kinds of universities that we have in our country that have crept their way into global university rankings and have been recognized as some of the best universities in the world. So for these reasons, there are benefits in being able to have that scope and have that reach and have your education system be recognized internationally, because this allows for greater research collaboration between wealthier countries. This allows for more resource sharing and knowledge sharing. So it's essentially good for science as well if university rankings cause the recognition of universities in countries that are ordinarily on the fringes of development and on the fringes of innovation in comparison to their Western counterparts, right? So the next issue that I want to talk about is inaccessibility, because we have to talk about money and monetary incentives. So oftentimes there are paywalls when we want to access certain scientific journals. This is because academic publishers make money by restricting access to information. Universities also pay to subscribe to journals, which is why oftentimes you can only access certain journals when you utilize your university email or you access it from your university library. And universities also pay their academics to do research and write papers with salary increases, bonuses, promotions being tied to your ability to produce research. So because of these monetary incentives, it can make science all the more inaccessible. So that's hard because science is already somewhat inaccessible in terms of, one, the language that we utilize, the specialization that's called to understand many of the different sorts of scientific issues. So if you're not an engineer, there's a limitation to your access to the kinds of knowledge that may be important in policy making about things like geoengineering, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to those kinds of barriers, we have a monetary barrier, which is why there are debates and about the clamor for open access journals and the rise of academic piracy sites, whether or not they're worth supporting, because even some academics and researchers support this as well. I've seen tweets about how people say that if you want to have access to a particular journal that's hidden behind a paywall, you should give messaging or emailing the researcher or the writer of that journal article a try, because sometimes they could just give it for free, even though the journal has a paywall for that particular article. So those are some of the debatable issues regarding accessibility. Now, on to politics and skewed research. So industry-funded research tends to set up questions that will give them desirable results. What do I mean by this? A demonstration of this real quick is that the candy industry, so I'm presuming Hershey's and other big brands, spent a significant fund of money pushing researchers to research on the health benefits of cacao and dark chocolate, which is why dark chocolate is universally recognized as a health food. That was because of the push of various candy corporations to research on the health benefits of chocolate so that as a marketing ploy, essentially. Like, even though their chocolate is not the healthy antioxidant rich things that the research is actually talking about, lay people can still tend to eat it up. um no pun intended, eat up that knowledge and that information in a way that is skewed towards what the manufacturers, chocolate and candy manufacturers, want them to believe. Another thing is that in a post-truth world, political demagogues and populists often antagonize scientists who are perceived to be in their ivory towers and cannot commune with the ordinary people. So this is where we see a rise in anti-vaxxers, a rise in the flat earthers, a rise in people who are skeptical about the existence of climate change because of certain political agendas that aim to derail our ability to understand the importance of scientists in our communities and in our lives. Now, on to Blue Skies research. Blue Skies research is essentially research that is curiosity driven, without a clear goal and without real world applications. So example of this simply would be space travel. So there's not really a connection. Of course, there are external benefits to certain research that we have. We can get benefits such as discovering things about energy, discovering things about where we can get more sustainable energy in space, etc. But the exploration of planets, the taking pictures of black holes, etc., this is driven primarily by human curiosity, right? So arguments in favor of blue skies research tend to be very pragmatic in terms of talking about the unanticipated scientific breakthroughs that are sometimes more valuable than agenda-driven research. Because the thing about innovation is that you can't really predict when your discoveries are going to be fruitful in such a way that suddenly it will create something life-changing in the next decade or 2 or 3, right? In fact, the creation of the touchscreen happened in the late 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, but it was only widely adopted in recent times. So we don't necessarily anticipate when scientific breakthroughs will happen. So the external benefits of blue skies research can be that, well, we sometimes discover random stuff that are extremely useful. But of course, there's a principled case for blue skies research about the nature of the human spirit and the scientific exploration behind it. So what is so beautiful about wanting to understand the universe and wanting to understand your place in the universe as a mere speck of stardust amidst the great galaxies in our ever-expanding, our ever-expanding place. So there are many reasons why we could support blue skies research, but of course there are many reasons against it, such as opportunity costs from the prioritization of things that are more pragmatic in nature, etc., etc. I just wanted to introduce you to arguments in favor of it because I feel like it's very easy to poo-poo something that's like, oh, it doesn't have a real world application and therefore it's not as much as a priority as climate change research and etc. So that concludes that segment on the research and academia. Now I'm going to talk about innovation. So let's talk first, what is innovation and what is the process behind innovation? So innovation is basically a new idea, creative thoughts, new imaginations in the form of device or method. And the process of innovating can be summarized as 1, idea generation, 2, advocacy and screening. So this is where you start talking about your idea to other people and start vetting whether or not it is something worth pursuing. 3rd is experimentation. 4th is commercialization. And 5th is diffusion and implementation. So what is diffusion? Diffusion is essentially the spread of technology, right? So on the diffusion of innovation, there exists a theory on the rate at which innovation spreads or diffuses throughout the specific population or social system. Since the adoption of innovation doesn't happen all at once, as I mentioned with the touch screen didn't happen immediately, we establish 5 adopter categories according to the speed at which they adapt. And these are the 5 adapter categories. So what we're doing now is we're breaking down the human population into 5 different types of actors, and how fast, depending on how fast they adapt and they accept innovation. So first are the innovators. So they're venturesome individuals that want to be the first to try new things. It takes very little to appeal to this category, probably like the Elon Musks of the world who aren't afraid to try new things. We have early adopters. So these are people in leadership roles, maybe CEOs, that are aware of the need to change and are comfortable with new ideas. They need a minimum of information sheets and instruction manuals to appeal to them. Next, we have ordinary people in the early majority. So they're rarely leaders, and they adopt innovation slightly faster than the average person. And usually what persuades them to adopt the innovations are success stories and evidence of the innovation's effectiveness in the past or with popular figures. Next is the late majority. So these are also ordinary people who tend to be skeptical of change and who only adopt innovation after the majority have successfully adopted it. So these late majority can be characterized as boomers, and the early majority can be characterized as the youth. You can argue that they are primarily the youth because of our adeptness of technology and adopting our eagerness to diffuse new technology into our lives. And lastly are the laggards. Laggards are conservative, tradition-bound individuals who are very skeptical. The strategies utilized to make them adapt include statistics, appealing to fear, so fear-mongering about how you're going to get sick if you do not get vaccinated, that kind of thing, and pressure from other adopter groups, whether it be through policy or through societal pressure. So that was just a mere discussion on how we can characterize the way that people react to innovation that might be useful in debates about the dissemination of new technologies and etc. Now let's talk about the W's of innovation. So the W's of innovation would be: who is doing the innovating, who funds innovation, what fields of innovation do we prioritize, why do we innovate, and where does the most innovation take place? So who is generally doing the innovating in our society right now? First would be R&D departments of corporations, of course, because they want to meet consumer needs. Secondly would be government bodies and research councils. Third would be entrepreneurs, motivated similarly by as corporations. And lastly would be academicians, scientists, and researchers. Who funds innovation? So we can divide it into private funding and public funding. For private funding, this usually comes from private companies, philanthropists, nonprofit foundations, crowdfunding, angel investors, venture capitalists, and etc., and are oftentimes motivated by their own specific private interests rather than interests of certain constituents of theirs, as opposed to public funding, where government-funded research is either conducted by the government or it's given through grants. So they outsource who does the research for them. They pay universities and other or corporations to do certain research for them and certain innovations for them. And they usually fund research for the benefit of specific agencies or industries such as healthcare and agriculture. But all in all, this is for the ultimate benefit of the taxpayer. So they're beholden to certain constituents. Yes, so there. What are the fields of innovation that we currently prioritize? So I just listed a few that are that tend to be high priority and pop up a lot now if you research on technologies to look out for, etc. So there's AI and robotics, there's medicine, there's sustainable city development, energy, environmental technology, agriculture and food sustainability. So a lot of it is about the sustainability of our lifestyles, um, and the increasing of our quality of life. So these are the fields that we tend to prioritize. Now, what are the reasons for us to make innovations? So I broke it down to three primary reasons. First is consumer demands and needs. So examples of this would be Airbnb, Uber, and Facebook popping up. Second would be urgent societal needs, such as examples of this would be the creation of sustainable energy technology or mRNA vaccines as a response to the COVID-19. And lastly, blue skies research. So this is space travel, the curiosity driven rather than necessity driven research that I talked about earlier. Where does the most innovation take place? So there's this thing called the Global Innovation Index that ranks countries according to how innovative they are. So it takes into account variables such as human capital, scientific institutions, technology, creative output, among other things. So if we just look at the top three, we see Switzerland is on top, followed by Sweden, followed by the United States. Um, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Switzerland has been named a global leader, like the number one global leader in terms of innovation for 10 years already. I don't know if that's in a row or what, but I know that they have topped this list repeatedly around 10 times, I think. Now, let's have some important innovation concepts and issues that we can discuss. So, I think important innovation concepts and issues that are often debatable or important in debate concepts are things such as outpacing regulation, automation and jobs, monopolies and patents, leapfrogging, and privacy violation. So let's talk about outpacing regulation, right? The thing about technology nowadays is that it oftentimes spreads exponentially. And there is a list of 6 Ds of exponential technologies. First, it's that it's digitized, which makes it easy to spread. Secondly, it's that it's deceptive, where growth seems slow at first, so it takes us by surprise when it suddenly is a part of our everyday lives. Third is that it's disruptive, where an existing market suffers, such as Airbnb and the traditional hotel industry. Fourth is that it's demonetized, which means that the technology to create and spread these technologies becomes cheaper. Um, Next, it's dematerialized, so less physical product is needed to create it when we have greater scales at which we are creating it. And lastly, democratized, where every average person has access to it. The thing about the spreading technologies is that exponential growth is often coupled with decreased cost. So the way that this happens, I want to introduce you to two concepts. First is Moore's law. Second is the Carlson curve. Moore's law is a principle that states that computing dramatically increases in power and decreases in relative costs at an exponential pace. So it just keeps getting faster and faster for all computers and machinery that we have. Which is why we tend to have much faster innovations and integrations of these innovations in our day-to-day lives. The Carlson curve, on the other hand, talks about how the costs of DNA sequencing has fallen at a rate 3 times faster than Moore's law. In the past 2 decades, the cost of sequencing the human genome fell drastically, and I'm sure that part of you guys know that that would primarily be attributable to the technology of CRISPR and such, because DNA sequencing and gene editing used to be very expensive, but now it is relatively fast and cheap with the advent of CRISPR. So the thing about exponential growth and decreased cost, or the spreading of technology really, really fast, is that it makes innovation incredibly hard to predict and regulate, but incredibly easy to develop and distribute to everybody. So While tech is changing exponentially, social, economic, and legal systems are still changing incrementally. They're scrambling to understand the way the world is evolving because of technology. And it's very hard for us to catch up with the implications of the technology that is spreading before we can even make rules about it. The other thing about it is that aside from the exponential ability to create it, is instant assimilation. So this is where societal attitudes come in, right? So we're kind of moving away from the techno panic where like, oh, science is scary, or scientific skepticism, and we're moving towards the quicker assimilation of tools into everyday lives. Look how quickly we adapt new social media, such as TikTok, or look how quickly we adapted Airbnb, Uber into our lives. There's a constant expectation for faster, better services. And because of this, the constant demand makes it hard for regulators to roll back on these innovations because we want things to be faster, we want things to be better. And when they're delivered to us as consumer goods, when they're made available to us as technology, the governments cannot just take that away from us, which makes it very difficult to roll back and regulate because it spreads faster than we can understand how to regulate it. What are the impacts then of poorly regulated technology? So firstly is the ethical considerations in their implementation, such as the CRISPR experiments on the two twins, twin fetuses. I forgot in what year. There was a there was an NDC motion about euthanizing the CRISPR twins, if I remember. I think that was in NDC 2019. So around that time, there were experiments done on by a Chinese experimenter on CRISPR twins where they deactivated a certain gene in order for them to become HIV resistant. But there was a lot of clamor against that because the deactivation of that gene had other implications towards their health because the gene supposedly has connections to their immune system. So that was considered to be an unethical experiment where basically deactivated a gene to protect them from highly preventable disease, and possibly increase their risks to new other diseases by compromising their immune systems as a whole. Secondly, the second impact of poorly regulated technology would be the implementation of imperfect or unsafe technology, such as self-driving cars, where we have heard of accidents because of the premature and quick adaptation of these self-driving cars. Lastly is the wide adaptation of flawed systems that create huge problems. So the examples that I picked here, the demonstrations I picked are Facebook, Uber, and Waze. Facebook, of course, is renowned for its fake news, for its contributions to populism, for rising hate speech. Uber, of course, its contribution, Uber and Grab, to be more relevant to the Philippine context, and its contribution to road congestion, and Waze, which has actual studies about it worsening traffic flow in general. So these are the impacts of some of the impacts of poorly regulated technology. Now, let's talk about automation and jobs. So the thing about automation and jobs is that there are lots of arguments about how it puts the most vulnerable workers at risk. So these are arguments that I'm sure you're all familiar with because physical jobs in structured and predictable environments, or people who do repetitive tasks such as data collection, are the ones who are most at risk of being replaced by automated machinery, right? So because you guys are familiar with the automation replacing people arguments, I'm gonna give some statistics on otherwise about how automation can possibly help jobs, since you're familiar with the other counterpart arguments. So the thing is, even with the risk of automation, less than 5% of occupations are candidates for full automation, meaning human capital is still considered a necessity. Now, globally, 87% of employers aim to increase or maintain the size of their staff despite increasing automation. Only 9% of employers want to cut jobs, and 25% want to actually increase employment. So, companies oftentimes respond to automation by upskilling their workforce or essentially retraining their workers so that their skills are no longer um, catered to the repetitive tasks, but rather higher skilled tasks that allow for the management of these automated machinery and whatnot. But of course, that doesn't change the fact that vulnerable people can still be very much replaced, which is still a very relevant concern, especially when automation is getting more and more complex and able to do more and more complex tasks. Now, automation also allows us to redefine what work is. Now, I'd say work is an unfortunate but necessary pain for our livelihood, but automation reduces these pains for everyone. So, embracing automation and high technology could actually empower individuals to create their own income without the need to work. So, um, maybe there will be a time where we can automate everything and companies will and we can live in welfare states and companies don't need to hire people to work. So that's sounds very utopian, but at the rate at which we are automating things with artificial intelligence that can mimic the ability for surgeons to uh, commit their procedures with the same precision, or artificial intelligence that can supposedly replace people from the criminal justice system, etc. Um, it's not that far off that maybe one day we won't have to work anymore. So onto automation and replacing key decision making. So beyond the vulnerable actors that do repetitive tasks, there are also discussions about things and debates about automating judges in the criminal justice system, replacing governments with algorithms, or integrating artificial intelligence in warfare. The thing about these kinds of debates, when you're replacing high-skilled people with automatons or artificial intelligence is how important is it that a human makes these decisions? So that's an important question to ask yourselves for these kinds of debates, rather than just saying, oh, will the computer make accurate decisions or not? Will it make mistakes? I mean, that's also an important question, but oftentimes leads to a lot of deadlockable issues rather than deeper discussions about the extent of involvement that humanity ought to have in the kinds of debates where people are being replaced from their jobs. Now, another concept about automation is that it is inevitable. So even if automation is something that is difficult, even if automation is something that is potentially harmful to developing nations where there are lower skilled workers who can more easily be replaced, it is going to be necessary to maintain the ability to compete or gain competitive advantages in manufacturing. A lot of controversy lies in what kind of policies we need to implement to minimize the short-term pains of increasing automation, what policies we need to keep up with this long-term necessity. So are there stopgap mechanisms that allow us to protect people who are losing their jobs in the process of us increasing automation or not? So this is a lot of where debate lies, and that we can't really backtrack on the fact that there are attempts to automate everything. Uh, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? That's up for you guys to debate about. So I hopefully gave you some concepts about automation that can allow you to answer that question more fruitfully in the future. Now, on to the ideas of monopolies and patents. So what exactly are the role of patents? What are patents exactly? They're a form of intellectual property that allows owners um, of certain technologies to exclude others from making, using, and selling a particular invention for a limited period of years. Patents and the abuse of patents often serve to strengthen existing monopolies, but a lot of people argue that they are necessary as an incentive for innovation. So I'm going to present two different views on how technological monopolies help innovation and how technological monopolies harm innovation, which can hopefully help you in future debates. So first, this is the how do I pronounce this? Schumpeterian view. So this is about a view that monopolies help innovation. It says that the larger the rewards, the greater the incentives firms have to innovate. So by large rewards, we mean stronger patent protection, right? So it's in line with making antitrust laws more lax, having stronger patent protections to drive more innovation. And the primary reason for this is because they say that large companies are the only actors that can afford sustained, multidisciplinary, mission-oriented, or highly specialized research and development necessary for major innovations. So because they are one of the few actors that are capable of sustaining such large-scale innovation, it is helpful for us to allow them to monopolize the market because they will just keep churning out new discoveries. They'll keep turning out new technologies, etc. Now, on to the next view, another hard to pronounce word, how monopolies harm innovation. So the Hayekian view, Hayekian view uh, says that innovation is a matter of trial and error, and maximizing innovation means maximizing the number of firms that have the opportunity to solve any given problem. So it's bad to have monopolies because when you only have one actor acting, you have less of a chance to have, to make chamba on that discovery that may be the very thing that creates the technology that changes the world. So large companies gradually start to focus on improving their business model rather than innovating. So they might just focus on being more efficient in creating this one particular technology rather than making things that are, actually better for humanity. Ahem, Apple or something. So yeah. Now, I want to introduce you to a certain book's take on patents. So there's a book that I really like that I feel is useful for other debaters. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of it already. It's called Bad Samaritans by Ha-Jun Chang. Its full name is Bad Samaritans, The Myth of Free Trade and the Secret History of Capitalism. So before I talk about the Bad Samaritans' take on patents, I'll give a synopsis of it. So the synopsis of Bad Samaritans is that basically rich and powerful governments and financial institutions such as WTO, the World Bank, and IMF act as bad Samaritans to developing nations by imposing neoliberal economic policies. The author analyzes the historical failures of this free market ideology, as well as the hypocrisy of these bad Samaritans in disallowing poorer states from utilizing the very same protectionist policies that grew the economies of wealthier nations. So very interesting read. So the take of this book on patents is that while bad Samaritans may claim that patents are necessary to encourage innovation, the reality is that other incentives exist to encourage innovation. The weakening of patent laws won't significantly harm innovation because incentives like scientific curiosity or just philanthropic desires to benefit humanity in general will still exist even without that monetary incentive, right? So their demonstration for this is that in the year 2000, only 43% of US drugs research funding came from the pharma industry. 29% came from the US government, and 28% came from private charities, actors that don't need to be motivated by patent protections. So they say that patents are only essential in some industries where copying is easy. Many companies don't need this because of the temporary technological monopoly that naturally emerges due to imitation lag, reputational advantage, and production experience. So this means that even though you don't intend to become a monopoly, the moment you create something, because it's hard to imitate because you were the first one to discover it, and you're the first one to discover the best procedure to create this technology, and you have an advantage as your reputation as being the first one to create this technology, you will have an artificial monopoly temporarily in the first place to protect you. So therefore, patents are not necessary. They also say that patents harm economic development by limiting the ability for developing countries to absorb advancing foreign technology. There's also the problem of interlocking patents, which harm innovation because of the disincentives um, caused by people avoiding patent infringement suits, especially coupled with the ease of acquiring patents due to the low bar on originality. So what are the book's demonstrations for these? So they gave two demonstrations for why patents are not necessarily good for developing nations. Firstly, many African countries suffering from an HIV or AIDS epidemic import copy drugs from India and Thailand that only cost 2 to 5% of the HIV and AIDS drugs manufactured in the West, which oftentimes cost $10,000 to $12,000 annually. The thing is, despite the legitimacy of IP restrictions when it clashes with public interest, 41 pharma companies band together and took the South African government to court in 2001. They withdrew their lawsuit after social campaigns and public uproar. So, um, of course, there are laws about IP restrictions when it's for the good of people, but that didn't stop those 41 pharma companies from trying to sue the South African government, essentially. But they didn't push through with that. But still, like that's completely ridiculous that they would want to prevent them from accessing cheaper HIV and AIDS medication, right? Another demonstration is in the year 2000, a group of scientists created something called golden rice, which is rice that is enriched with beta carotene that aim to supplement the vitamin A deficient diets of people in the developing world. But in 2001, the scientists caused controversy by selling the technology to Syngenta, which is a multinational pharmaceutical firm. And it upset a lot of people because they're like, this is supposed to be a public good, but you sold it to a profit oriented body. The thing is, the scientists needed to sell it to a firm that had the resources to negotiate licenses for patented technology that they needed to operationalize the rice technology. Because as mere scientists, they didn't have the legal resources to negotiate for the 70 relevant interlocking patents before launching the product. So that's why they needed a monetary, a money-making body to take on that kind of project. So they cannot just release it as a public good because interlocking patents would be a huge financial barrier to their ability to disseminate golden rice. So those are examples of when interlocking patents harm innovation. Those are examples of when patents harm economic development or harm developing nations. The next concept that I'd like to introduce is leapfrogging. So leapfrogging refers to a phenomenon in which developing nations, particularly African ones, are skipping the costs of technological innovations, the process of technological innovations. What they do is they leapfrog over obsolete technologies and go straight to modern tech at a greener, cheaper, and more sustainable cost than independent innovation would have cost them. So this would manifest in the following sectors. First, on energy. So many rural African communities that lacked electrical grids ended up being provided with solar panels by startups such as Off-Grid Electric and Black Star Energy, instead of going through the process of installing traditional American-style grids. So instead of going through the process of developing traditional forms of electricity electrical grids, which would have taken more time for them before they could reach solar panels, they immediately got solar panels installed instead and skipped the whole process of having the traditional and less environmentally friendly electrical grids. So various rural communities also adapted mini grid models that were powered by renewable resources in these African communities. Secondly, on connectivity. Instead of investing in a landline system, many Africans jumped directly to using mobile phones. This ended up driving mobile money, which provided a secure way to invest, save, and transfer funds, which ultimately helped almost 200,000 Kenyans escape extreme poverty. Another instance of leapfrogging is on education, where scripted lesson plans and virtual tutors allowed for private schools and educators to spread their educational resources to far-flung areas in the developing world. In particular, Bridge International Academies provided scripted lesson plans to teachers, which resulted in Kenyan students performing above average in national exams because they were able to access these scripted lesson plans. Another example of leapfrogging would be in agriculture, where mobile platforms connecting smallholder farmers to buyers and banks, such as 2Qs, which helped align the farmer's supply to meet the market demands. And next would be healthcare, where the implementing of a robotic pharmacy system in the Helen Joseph Hospital in Johannesburg reduced prescription errors and significantly reduced patient wait time from 4 hours to under 20 minutes. So leapfrogging is an important concept in case debaters say like, oh, it's too expensive to innovate or shift to, or for impoverished nations to shift to new technologies. Leapfrogging could be an argumentation in favor of how actually these poor countries don't need to go through the whole as industrial revolution like we did. They can actually just acquire this new technology and have it be implemented due to altruistic third parties from wealthier nations and such. So that's how I would necessarily apply leapfrogging as a concept to debates. Lastly, on privacy violation as an issue. So threats to privacy, examples of this would be surveillance, facial recognition, medicine, social media, medicine because they can keep your historical records of your diseases and etc. Sorry if you can hear my dog. Next is social media, of course, as you are the product when it comes to social media. And lastly is deep fakes. So threats to privacy, so there's a lot of questions as to whether we still have privacy nowadays in a world where we're always surveilled, or where we even volunteer to our own information and give it up easily to corporations that, you know, are essentially just feeding us brain junk food on social media, right? So there is something called privacy by design, which is a framework of systems engineering incorporated by the EU currently. So it tries to say that when we're designing new technology, we need to attempt to accomplish the following things. Firstly, that privacy is proactive and preventative. Secondly, is that privacy is a default setting, not something that is an afterthought. Third is that privacy is a core function, so something that is very integral to the way that the technology works. Next is that privacy must be positive sum, which means that when you utilize privacy features of certain technologies, it should not detract from the quality of experience that you're having from the technology. It should just merely add to the benefits of that technology. Next is privacy must offer end-to-end life cycle protection, which means that from the moment you start using the technology to whenever you may stop using that technology, will your data be deleted? Will it be stored somewhere securely, etc. And lastly, privacy must be user-centric as opposed to centered around anyone else. So user-centric means that it can be highly personalized in accordance to what you need. So this is by no means a law. It's something that the EU just wants to guide innovators towards because of all the risks that we see in in the advent of things like the Internet of Things, in the advent of us being surveilled, in the advent of us volunteering our information out to social media even more, this privacy by design is one way that we can try to innovate in such a way that we still protect integral parts of our identity. Now, the last part of my lecture is just a discussion of emerging technologies and essentially tech to look out for. Firstly, on AI. Sorry, I didn't delete the bring attention of your audience over a key concept part of the format. So artificial intelligence. So human intelligence is characterized by learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, and the using of language. So we try to imitate human intellect in different machinery and different programs and robots. So we can divide this into weak AI and strong AI. Weak AI and strong AI. So weak AI would focus on performing specific tasks, such as playing chess, answering questions based on user input, or as you can see on the screen, the things that we have everyday use of, where it's like your smart air conditioner, autonomous cars, these would be manifestations of weak AI since they often have repetitive features that they need to focus on. Strong AI, however, is AI that can perform a multitude of functions and can often teach itself to solve new problems. So I think this is where our curiosities are most captured. So have you guys heard of Sophia? Sophia, the humanoid robot? I'm sure that you guys have seen that female robot who was developed by a Hong Kong-based company called Hanson Robotics, and was given Saudi Arabian citizenship. It's the first robot to ever receive citizenship. So Sophia uses AI and is arguably using strong AI to converse with people and deliver speeches and such. And people are fascinated by her because they feel like she's a manifestation of how close we are in terms of getting robots to manifest human intellect at a high level. Excuse me, that's with my dog again. So yeah, I think the reason this captures our attention is because it poses a lot of questions about the citizenship of future robots. It poses a lot. Excuse me, I'll just tell my dog to be quiet. Mommy, I'm lecturing. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, so strong AI, I think it captures our attention because it poses a lot of question about what it means to be human because of our, because when we talk about intellect, is this something that is inherently and inextricably linked with consciousness? Can we create sentient beings? And if we do, what is our responsibility towards them? I've seen a lot of debates that oftentimes explore that kind of theme nowadays. And it begs the question, do we offer them citizenship? Do we offer them rights? Do we offer them protection? It also begs the question as to whether or not they pose a threat to us in the future, if we integrate them in our governing bodies, if we integrate them in the systems by which we perform surgeries, we perform our criminal justice system. How scary is it for us to relinquish our power as humans to human-like things? So I think that there's a lot of philosophical queries regarding artificial intelligence that may sound like they lie in the sci-fi kind of field of the world, but are actually integral questions because we are trying to develop the most intelligent beings that we can. We are trying to really mimic, map, and pattern the human brain to the best of our abilities through the creation of neural networks, through deep learning, etc. So next, I want to talk about mRNA vaccines. So the thing about mRNA vaccines and comparing them to traditional vaccines is that traditional vaccines expose the body to proteins made by a virus or bacteria, and they're usually made from a weakened or inactive version of the virus or bacteria. Popular vaccines such as the MMR vaccine and the pneumonia vaccine are examples of these traditional vaccines, right? The thing about mRNA vaccines is that they have similar objectives, but they do function differently. Instead of introducing a weakened version of the virus, what they do is they simulate a part of the virus's genetic code, which then instructs our cells to build a protein similar to the virus, which results in the triggering of an immune response. And note that, as shown in this diagram, it's oftentimes faster to produce mRNA molecules than it is to produce the right type of microbial protein or the inactive microbe that's necessary for traditional vaccines, which is why we were able to roll it out so fast. But you may question, is it where did mRNA vaccines come from? Like, it seemed like they just popped up out of nowhere as a silver bullet solution to the COVID situation, right? But the thing is, innovation goes as far back as the 1960s from the discovery of mRNA. Following the discovery of mRNA, there's a lot of research about wrapping mRNA in liposomes, so fatty cells, and using these liposomes to deliver mRNA to other cells in the body. There's also the discovery of the synthesization of mRNA in laboratories and the testing of mRNA delivered and packaged in liposomes as treatments in rats and mice. So from the 1960s, I believe that mRNA vaccines were actually discovered, or the breakthrough that allowed us to create mRNA vaccines were eventually discovered in the 1990s to early 2000s. I can share a link article for this later on. But essentially, it just goes to show that even though it seems to have popped up out of nowhere, it's actually a decades long it's been decades long in the making, and it's a foolish thought to think that innovation just happens in an instance, because innovation always happens in accordance to a family tree of other innovations. So if we trace it farther and farther back, we can see how long it took for us to actually get to being able to produce mRNA vaccines at a mass scale. So here is just a snapshot of the history of mRNA vaccines. So it starts with studying of what mRNA is, or messenger RNA. It studies the lipid-based delivery systems, and it talks about putting mRNA inside lipids for vaccinations. So the timeline starts as early as the 1960s, which thankfully allowed us to implement things in time for the pandemic. So the next innovation that I'd like to talk about is geoengineering. So what is geoengineering? I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to remove the bring the attention of your audience over a key concept part of the slide. So, okay. So geoengineering is basically just the large-scale manipulation of processes central to controlling the Earth's climate. So it's essentially planetary engineering. We're changing the way the world works. We're not just polluting it. We're not just seeking stuff on top of it, but we're fundamentally messing with the way the weather works and the way we capture carbon dioxide, etc. The thing about geoengineering is that it can be traced to the early years of the Cold War, when um, scientists of both the United States and the Soviet Union devoted huge budgets to controlling weather, to studying the controlling of weather as a part of military strategy. So that's where the origins come from. Now, there are two major focuses of geoengineering methods, which involve the CO2 removal and solar geoengineering. So for CO2 removal, two examples that I can think of off the top of my head are ocean fertilization, which happens when you dump iron dust into the ocean to trigger algal blooms that would absorb large quantities of carbon dioxide. There's also carbon burial, uh, aka carbon capture or carbon sequestration, if I'm not mistaken, where it involves the pumping of pressurized CO2 into suitable geological structures deep underground or deep in the ocean. Um, so that's for CO2 removal. Geoengineering for solar geoengineering involves things such as cloud seeding, where we uh, use certain materials, for example, seawater, but of course other materials can be utilized, spraying seawater thousands of meters into the air to seed the formation of stratocumulus clouds that would deflect sunlight. Since we know that part of the thing that contributes to the global warming is the depletion of the ozone layer, which allows for more solar heat to enter our Earth and melt ice caps, etc., etc. So cloud seeding can allow us to deflect sunlight in such a way. It also involves things such as installing sun shields and mirrors in space that can deflect sunlight, or injecting sun blocking particles into space, or spraying sulfates into the atmospheres and other aerosols that are reflective in nature. So what are the qualms and what exactly is controversial about geoengineering? It's controversial because it essentially aims to modify the global climate. In a way, it's another way for humans to play God. For some people, they might think of it that way, because limited scientific knowledge means that we don't know how largely we should scale geoengineering methods, which means that we don't know how the environment would react to massive manipulation. Droughts, floods, and other natural catastrophes can make everything worse for us in the long run, or the disruption of marine ecosystems, or any ecosystem really, because of the sudden changes in climate due to the cloud seeding, making things colder, adding precipitation, or due to the pipes being added for CO2, for carbon sequestration, etc., disrupting marine life. So it can really change the way things work for specific ecosystems, which may cause inadvertent harms that we do not understand yet. And lastly, a harm regarding or a controversy surrounding geoengineering is that it may create some opportunity cost or act as a scapegoat for people to stop or deprioritize the search for cleaner fuel or power, which would cause politicians to backpedal on promises to cut greenhouse gas emissions, which would worsen emissions in general, because these efforts for geoengineering are extremely expensive at the end of the day. Now, the last technology that I want to talk about, and the last part of the lectures before question and answer portions, is CRISPR. So CRISPR is basically a gene editing technology that was introduced in 2012. So I'll just explain it in layman's terms rather than utilizing the description using the Cas9 protein. But it's a method. This technology is a method of finding a specific bit of DNA inside a cell. And when you find a specific bit of DNA, you can do a couple of things. You can alter that DNA, or you can turn the genes on and off without altering the sequence of the DNA, which is what essentially happened with the CRISPR twins that the Chinese scientists experimented on. The gene that was disabled in them was the CCR5 gene, which supposedly allows them to be resistant to HIV. The thing about CRISPR is that it's now cheap and easy compared to its previous genetic engineering technologies that it predated 2012, which is what makes it so groundbreaking. Its applications, of course, exist in things such as agriculture, creating disease-resistant crops and livestock, and of course, medicine, which is generally one of the most important aspects of it, where we can make personalized medicine according to what your specific DNA needs, or we can prevent diseases through genetic modifications early on. Now, this has interesting implications regarding the way that we approach gene editing and the way that we approach modifying the human race as a whole. So while I was researching, I was before for motions, I forgot which tournament I ran this motion for. I ran a motion about supporting liberal eugenics. So liberal eugenics refers to treating parents as consumers, wherein rather than authoritative eugenics, where some authority dictates, oh, this is the ideal human race, parents get to determine what is ideal for their child through gene editing, through editing out the potential diseases, or even selecting genetic traits that can modify their children in accordance to things that will make them experience more advantageous lives through higher IQ, being taller, being stronger, etc. So there is an interesting angle about whether or not this would deepen inequality in the future if this kind of technology becomes accessible to the extent that people can be consumers of it. It's an interesting angle also about whether or not this would create greater inequality, or how we should regulate it fundamentally, because this is undeniably important in the ability for us to control disease and to treat disease and lessen human suffering on net. But it also begs a lot of questions to the extent to which we are going to be allowing people, and parents in particular, to modify the genes of their children. So there's the whole eugenics angle to it as well, which is I find particularly fascinating about CRISPR. And of course, there are also the ethical ramifications and considerations, such as the case of the CRISPR twins, whose genes were edited without their consent in order to protect them from a preventable disease, but ultimately possibly compromising their immune systems and such. So there are many issues surrounding gene editing because it's a sensitive topic that has its roots in making the ideal human, or making the ideal human race. Whenever there is a concept that relates to that, it's always going to be a red flag, because it's going to relate in some way to possibly to eugenics. So that's what I find fascinating about the possibilities of the commercialization of gene editing in the future, if it does indeed become accessible and regulated to the extent that multiple people can access it, and it gets diffused to such an extent that it's democratized all throughout the world to parents. So this actually concludes my my lecture on science and technology. Before I close, I'd just like to end with a takeaway about having a scientific mindset. So even though we in the audience and I myself are not necessarily scientists, it's always good to explore the world with some level of curiosity and yearning for knowledge. And another thing about the scientific mindset is to have humility to know when you are wrong, and to be willing to be corrected in order to have the most accurate information in your hands. So I hope that everybody takes away the idea that the world would be a better place if we had that more scientific mindset when we approach various issues. And if you have any questions, you feel free to reach out to me on Discord or on Facebook. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you, Denise. Now we're open for questions. So I sent the link to the Slido via chat. If you just recently joined or if you can't find it, I am resending it now. You may also send them to me or to Denise via Zoom DM, or you may also unmute. That also works. I can also share my screen. Wait.
Okay. I can't recommend a lot of science podcasts, but I can recommend YouTube channels. I love Kurzgesagt as a way of scientific curiosity. So that's my favorite relaxation science kind of video. I think aside from having good political summaries too, Vox can also have certain good summaries for scientific issues. I also, instead of podcasts, because I read more scientific articles, like short ones that are not journal articles. Scientific American in particular is one of my favorite sources for matter loading on science. I think that's related to the other question. Do you have any tips and suggested resources for matter loading on science technology? I already noted Bad Samaritan. Thank you. So yeah, Scientific American is one of my go-to, and I think that one of the underrated things to do is to actually utilize your university services to access journal articles on your free time. So if ever you want to know what to research on, just pick a motion that you find particularly hard. So whether it be sociological or cultural in nature, there's going to be a journal article out there for it. And you just you can use Google Scholar to find peer-reviewed journals that are open access. So if you don't want to be flooded with BuzzFeed articles or Vox articles, I suggest just using Google Scholar. What are good issues or frameworks that are helpful in adjudicating science-based debates? Okay, that's a good question. So I think that the thing is, science-based debates are extremely broad and are dependent on things such as, is it about the implementation of a new technology? Is it about scientific exploration for the sake of scientific exploration? So I think that frameworks that you can utilize or issues that you can look at are, firstly, you can look at the different actors and stakeholders in the debate who is necessarily producing, benefiting from these kinds of technologies or scientific discoveries. So always look into the actors. Secondly, you can make issues out of what are the most relevant scientific discoveries or the most relevant scientific topics currently. So the idea of opportunity costs and such, the idea of opportunity costs and such is one that you can explore, because when you pour funds into certain scientific endeavors, you necessarily may be depriving funds from other scientific endeavors. So an issue might be on a prioritization of scientific processes, like in the geoengineering. Would you rather abandon traditional means of looking for sustainable energy in favor of mass geoengineering or not? So those are just some of the issues off the top of my head that I can think of. This is a very broad question that I think that you can utilize the characterizations and framework that I mentioned in my lecture. So if you have a specific motion in mind, maybe we can brainstorm that together. When is it necessary to reuse or recycle arguments in terms of science-themed motions? That's a very interesting question, because I always think that debates, there's a finite number of debates in the world. I've had coaches tell me, of course, this is just a figure of speech, that there are only 10 debates in the world, and everything is just a repetition of every other debate with new nuances and new wording. So the thing is, um, it's up to you to decide when you can reuse and recycle arguments, because the debates are very limited. Like, um, the more experience you have in the debate, the more you realize that the core clashes of different debates are just repetitions of old debates worded differently, with different actors, with different technologies, with different international relations problems, but they're the same kinds of issues repeating themselves over and over again. So don't be afraid to recycle or reuse arguments, but just make sure you read the motion and that you nuance your arguments, even though they have been utilized before, maybe in your previous case builds or previous debates. Make sure you nuance it specifically to the motion to avoid just having a canned case. So canned case just refers to something that, you know, it's just canned in your drawer of arguments, and you just pull it out and plop it onto the table without making efforts to modify it in such a way that it approaches the nuances of the debate. So I'd say that don't be afraid of linking previous arguments to new cases, because debate is, there are a finite amount of ideas and there are a finite amount of debates out there in the world, and eventually ideas are going to be reutilized. Next, how can we mitigate the harmful impacts of exponential tech, especially on the issue that society adjusts incrementally? Should I answer nihilistically? The thing is, um, I'm very pessimistic about this, because I think that uh, this is where we approach with the stronger precautionary principle. So this is where governments and governing bodies, international bodies, need to intervene and actually express stronger policy making against the implementation of certain things, maybe like cryptocurrency and whatnot, um, and be more speculative. But the problem is, if you're like that nowadays, you're going to be considered anti-science. So I think that humanity has reached the point where scientific progress for the sake of progress has is not necessarily scientific progress for the sake of progress is not necessarily predictable anymore. So it's very pessimistic of me to say this, but I think that we can't truthfully mitigate the harms of exponential technology unless we get more scientists in government seats, unless we become more technocratic in nature, because always going to be a disjoint between policymakers and science, um, if we do not allow more scientific individuals in seats of governance. So I'd say that's how we can mitigate the harmful impacts of exponential tech, by having people in power be the ones who are innovators, be the ones who are involved in the making of new technology. So that would be my personal view. So the next question. Hi, Denise. Just want to ask if medical immunization to extent is genetic engineering. I'd say not necessarily, because immunization just involves, what do you call this? The forcing of an immune response. If you're talking about vaccines in particular, it just involves the forcing of a natural immune response in your body by the creation of antibodies. So this is essentially what would happen anyway if you got infected by a disease. So it's not altering your genetic code, but rather it is just mimicking a natural response to some kind of foreign microbiome inside you, and microbe inside you. So yeah. Next, what's your thought process when a science motion is talking about a very hypothetical technology? This house would ban, this house would ban the development of strong AI. So my thought process would be asking broad questions first. So broad questions meaning, what is the purpose of science in the first place? Um, what is when do we ban is an important question. Like, it sounds very simple, but if you think about it, there are very few things that we would just outright ban, aside from eugenics and cruel experimentation. We even allowed people to be infected with COVID after being immunized. So there are very few things. So banning is an extremely high threshold for something. So what are the harms that meet that extraordinarily high threshold that cause us to need to ban it? I know that, and then I would think about the implications of strong AI. I would think about what matter do I know related to this. I know that I think even the United States government considers the possibility of developing strong AI as a threat to international security or something like that. So my so in general, my answer to the thought process for a science motion that's extremely hypothetical is always ask broad questions um, about the deeper meaning behind science, um, the deeper reason behind why we're developing this technology, and of course utilize the words in the motion to form questions of the debate, such as when do we ban things. So when you're able to answer these fundamental questions, this is usually when you're able to create arguments or create at least standards that you need to meet before you say, oh, this is when we ban something, when it has lasting harms, when it has intergenerational harms, when there's no other way to regulate it, ganon. Okay, so the next question. How do you strategically package principled arguments for science-themed motions? I'd say you approach principled arguments the same way that you would approach them in any other motion, because science is hardly ever fully pragmatic or only pragmatic, right? Um, uh, I'd say it's important to use rhetorical language to package your principled arguments by citing beautiful aspects of science. So what do I mean by beautiful aspects of science? So you can talk about our uh, space being our final frontier. You can talk about the curiosity that has allowed us to interact with the stars, etc., etc. So I would always package a principled argument for science in accordance to research that is curiosity driven, in accordance to things that don't seem useful but are beautiful by nature and that tickle your curiosity, because that's the way that you make people feel that science is not just a pragmatic this or that technology. You make people have to feel that there's more to science than um, just technological advancement for the sake of advancement. So I would use descriptors of what you consider to be beautiful and interesting and fascinating scientific discoveries. And what's beautiful, fascinating, and interesting depends on you. So there can be many things that fascinate you about science, such as the constant search for the development of things that mimic human consciousness as fundamentally scary and fundamentally exciting. So I'd say stick to what you consider beautiful, stick to what you consider exciting personally.